Welcome back to Sanctuary Peacemakers. Today I'm joined by Eric Robinson. Eric recently retired from the FBI after 24 years as a special agent. During his career, he worked everything from counterterrorism to crimes against children, served as a SWAT operator and firearms instructor, and trained agents in tactics and defensive skills. Before all that, Eric spent 12 years in Christian ministry, including pastoring a Baptist church. That unique combination of ministry and federal law enforcement gives him a perspective on church safety that very few people have. Eric, thanks for joining me.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you. When I came across your podcast, I was like, this meshes well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've noticed there's not a lot of other podcasts that speak on the topic. Your background is pretty unusual, going from ministry to the FBI. How did that transaction actually happen or
Well,
transition?
sure. And speaking with people who are familiar with churches is enjoyable because usually they get it. I, I had started a Baptist church that was meant to reach out to people who don't normally feel comfortable in church. And so, we just didn't want to swap Christians from that pew to that pew. But part of the issue with that, of reaching out to people who aren't familiar with church, is they had a lot of their own personal problems that they brought with them. And my problem with that was that I was not able to unburden myself with it. And so for 2 years straight, I had stress related headaches every single day. And, and this is where hopefully, you get it. I had to find something with less stress. And people laugh because they're like, "Oh, how is the FBI less stress?" But
I was just going to ask that.
but it is. Like when someone comes to you and says, my 16-year-old daughter is pregnant." Like, I don't just I should have just let it go, but I wasn't able to. Meanwhile, I was working with 16-year-old girls in the FBI who were prostituting, which is much worse, and I was
Right.
able to let that go because it didn't it wasn't something for me to hold on to. And if
Right.
we
You didn't know them on the same personal level, I'm guessing.
Right, and I could only do certain criminal justice things to help them.
Right.
And so if we go to arrest 10 people and one of them gets away, I don't care. Like, they'll get caught, but that was different in the church. So, and what was my cue that I had made the right decision was the day that I was accepted in the FBI, my headaches went away.
Oh, yeah. Then that would be a very good indicator that you're in the right spot.
And I was glad because I thought I can't deal with this anymore. But yeah, so
Right.
then in 2002, I preached on Easter Sunday in my church. The next Sunday, I was in Quantico, Virginia, and then the Sunday after that, I preached in the chapel in at the academy because they didn't have a chaplain and they needed somebody to fill in.
So did while you were in the FBI, did you kind of marry the two a little bit? Like, were you like the pastor of your of the people that were in your
Well,
unit or whatever?
yeah, I got the nickname Preacher right off the bat, which was great. So then I spent 8 years in Chicago and they called me Preacher. And then when I transferred to Toledo, Ohio to the Cleveland division, it seems awkward to tell people this is what my nickname is. So, that went away. But I didn't feel like it was a stretch to look at what I was doing with the FBI to still be doing God's work.
Right.
Because if you have harm come to you, the church definitely has a role to fill. But one of those roles is not bringing you justice. And so if your house is burglarized, your child is harmed, whatever it might be, the church isn't going to be able to step in and bring justice to you for that. And I felt like that's something God wants, and I was doing that work.
Fair enough. So you mentioned something interesting earlier about SWAT operations, that everything is planned in advance so people aren't making decisions in the moment. how should churches think about planning in a similar way?
Yeah, absolutely. So with SWAT, we are training regularly. So if we need to make a spot decision, you're hoping that the tactics that you've learned are going to kick in and people will read off of you. Obviously, in a church, that's not going on. No
Right.
matter what type of security element you have, these guys aren't training like SWAT operators weekly, intensely.
Hopefully.
Yeah, I would doubt it. And so, they don't have that ability to just read and react like someone professional does. But even with that knowledge of like, I know these guys are going to do their job right, we plan things as much as we can down to the details,
Mhm.
which means I know what tools I need. I know who I follow and who's behind me. I know what wave I'm going up in. And part of what we discussed as well before we were to hit a house, we have the full brief the day before. And then the morning of, very early, we would talk about what is the worst thing that can happen. And that might be guys on the backside start taking fire. And now, rather than go, oh my gosh, we're under fire and a guy's been shot in the chest, we already have a plan that these people know that they're going to do that. It's a calming effect. And the other thing that we would go through would be to talk about what's the most likely problem to happen,
Mhm.
such as we roll up in our Bearcat, our armored Bearcat, and we're ready to go. But as we get to the house, the subject is entering his vehicle, and now things are thrown into a different plan. So that's not
Right.
it's not terrible, but it goes against what we've planned, and so now we need to at least discuss this.
You kind of have to adapt.
And if you're adapting ahead of time, you're not caught in a moment relying that you're going to make the decisions you make in a cool period the same that you would in an escalated period.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. Um, and one of the things that you had mentioned was adapting to any given situation. With that kind of in mind, when churches think about safety, they usually jump straight to mass shootings. But in reality, what are some of the other uh, situations that church might face regarding like violence or different issues, other than the obvious like medical and fire? I'm talking more along the physical or that kind of thing.
Well, even to the medical, as you say, do do you know who's trained? So, I mean, these things have to be laid out ahead of time. That where's the AED? Is it marked well enough? Is there a trauma kit on hand? And do people know how to? I mean, at least having a handful of people trained on it. And much like in a church, if I'm carrying a gun, I want you, if you're carrying a gun, to know I'm carrying a gun, and everyone needs to know who these people are and what their roles are. So some of the issues that are going to come up, I had a buddy contact me after retirement, and he said, "Hey, we had a guy come to our church who was doing an ICE protest, which I mean, it's an evangelical church. I mean,
Hmm.
I think he was making assumptions. Like there was nothing in this church that said we're pro ICE and we're, very patriotic. You support the troops and the
Right.
but it was a large church, so the man came there. So here is what do you do with public demonstration?
Yeah.
And how does that match with the vision and mission of your church? Is this something you want to allow to this extent? How do we handle it? So here's somebody who's protesting, and I'm a cranky guy who gets set off, and all of a sudden I'm tackling him in front of kids. Is that what we want, or do we not want it?
Right, right. And I'm, in that regard, I'm a huge advocate of de-escalation, conflict resolution. In fact, I built a class just on that I teach because I think that is the first step to prevention. And another thing that you'd mentioned is knowing who carries a firearm. And I don't think people realize how important that is.
Oh
in
boy.
a church setting. Like, I have been a very strong advocate of, as a head safety officer at my church, I want to know everybody who is or isn't carrying. I don't mind if people carry that are not on the team, but I need to know it, because if something happens, somebody comes in and starts firing, I don't want to aim at the wrong person thinking that they're the suspect. Come to find out, they were aiming at the suspect and I just took them out.
Well, and you also don't want a stampede where I'm raising my hands in hallelujah and Gladys behind me sees a bulge, in my pants with that's a gun. And
Right.
and all of a sudden now there's a great fear. If she comes to you and
Right.
says, "Eric, I saw something in Eric's or that man's waistline," and you're like, I know he's carrying, we're cleared. And then my question is, do you have conversations with those who are carrying to at least assess their capabilities?
Well, and that's the other reason. And see, I'm fortunate at the church I attend. It's only the safety team that grants approval, and it's really only the safety team that carries. But I do know that in some other states that, see, here in Michigan, you have to have the like leadership authority, a sign off in order to carry. So we can kind of monitor a little bit. But in states like Texas or Missouri or Kansas, where it's a lot more open about where you can or cannot carry, um, then it's a little more difficult to kind of monitor and keep track of who is or is not carrying.
Well, the next step then too, if you're in a state like that, how is it handled if I talk to Jim who says he's carrying and I said, "Hey, can we talk about it?" and he's just obstinate and says, "I'm going to carry and you can't stop me." And now where are you for next steps? And you have to have that buy-in from leadership too of like, "Hey,
Yeah.
maybe we talk to Jim and we utilize your de-escalation tools, but get to a place where, look, can you come on board and work with us? Because yeah,
Yeah.
I don't want people carrying that I don't trust carrying."
Yeah, and that might be the best case scenario, is if you can't get them to stop carrying, bring them on board and train them properly, so at least you'll be able to know that he's doing everything right.
Right.
So, in the cases that you worked on, were there warning signs that showed up before things escalated?
So I've worked a few cases where we've prevented mass shooters, and in those instances, and I would suggest this because it can translate over to some degree. One was where an individual was concerned about his roommates preparing to be mass shooters. Well, when you see something like that, you come to the FBI.
Yeah,
And in a case like that, they need to know to come to you or whoever is head of security. And it's a similar principle of, I have a concern, and that might be, this woman and her children are coming to the church, and the husband was engaged in domestic violence before, and he's been, I can see his feed. He's now someone comes to you and say, "Hey, just so that you know, the ex-husband may show up." And we had a case like that at my old church where I love the pastor and he handled this very well. There was a man who was a registered sex offender, and the pastor said, "You're welcome here. However, you are not welcome to go into the children's wing on your own. You must
right.
have an escort." And he had an attitude and he said, I'm going to do whatever I want. So he went down the children's wing to pick up his kids. And the pastor politely said, "Well, you're trespassed from here." And that's an option for the church as well.
Yeah,
And then that man said, "Well, now I'm going to show up at your trunk or treat." And so, fortunately for that, that was tipped off. The assistant pastor was notified that, hey, this guy is saying he's going to show up. And so we had a security team, but the assistant pastor came to me and said, "Hey, I'd like it if you could have your eye out too." And lo and behold, he showed up. And we had some preparation, but didn't have that full preparation of what do we do when someone who's trespassed comes back. And
Yeah.
this is part of that discussion that needs to take place ahead of time. So what happened was I'm on the phone with my chief division counsel, our FBI attorney, and says, "Hey, what am I in line to do? Can I remove him? Can I get physical? If he gets physical, can I put him in handcuffs until the sheriff arrives?" And she said, "Yes, yes, and yes." And that's where I tried to de-escalate, but he started yelling, and so now we have a wrestling match in front of 1,000 kids, and it's less than ideal,
Yeah.
but that's what we came to.
Now, you mentioned the alert framework, run, hide, fight.
Right.
A couple questions on that. Number one, how does that different uh, differ from the Alice program, which is when I first came when I first started building the safety ministry at my church, I had the local PD come in and teach the Alice program. I've also gone through, I forget what the other one was, but there was another one that active shooter training that I went through. Um, so how does that differ, and how should churches think about that realistically?
Yeah, they're not going to differ. I think you have an advantage of taking as many of those as you can, and sometimes there's variations that you pick up, but they're all going to be run, hide, fight, or somebody uses different acronyms. And the main idea is of people getting out of harm's way, and especially in such a soft target like a church,
Yeah,
needing to be prepared. And that's where if I have that thought of what to do ahead of time, and here's a snap, I am moving.
yeah,
I already have that. I'm taking people to go here. So a couple of things that I'd say about that. One is I've been in 3 situations where shots have been fired in my presence. Not to include the range, because that's thousands of times.
yeah,
But
right,
but on 3 occasions during arrests, I've been in the vicinity of shots fired, and each of those 3 times, my response was that a gunshot? I think that was a gunshot.
yeah,
And that's me being familiar. So if you think you will know when a mass shooting happens, you might be wrong. And if you see news, people are like, I thought it was fireworks, I thought it was something else. And now you've lost seconds and lives knowing how to respond.
right,
So the practical things that a church can do, one is you're maximizing exits, which you know where to go, and you're minimizing the entrances.
right,
So people are coming in through one avenue, and now you can have eyes there. That also can be the one avenue or a secondary behind that you can now block access.
right. And that's one of the things that my church is fortunate enough to do. And we also have iPad with cameras so we can see people outside. When I did the interview with Jay Trombley, the um, safety officer who saved lives over at Crosspoint Church, he said the same. He was saying the same thing. Like at first, he did not recognize it as gunfire because our brains are not trained to think about it that way. And it
Yeah.
wasn't until one of the, I believe the parishioners had come in and said, all he remembers her saying was AR-15. And that was the most important part, obviously. And that's when things really kicked off for him. But the initial sound, he didn't recognize as being gunfire.
Right.
So that does seem to be a very common thing for, like you said, even people who recognize gunfire that may go to the range all the time, but it sounds different in a real world scenario like that.
Well, and keep in mind, he's saying, oh, okay, I have a problem putting these two together because there's not gunfire in church. I was
Right,
on, I was on a SWAT op where I should expect the possibility of gunfire, and even then, I'm like
right,
that. And on the one, it wasn't until I finished clearing the upstairs and came down and went, okay, I smell it. That was gunfire. So you mentioned cameras. And this is the difficult reality. So it's not just here's how we shoot back or do something else, but in the preparation, part of the preparation is what do we do after?
Right.
Because there's prevention. Here's how we deny access, but also, okay, now this happened and 8 members were killed and 15 wounded. The cameras are essential.
Yeah.
Because now maybe he comes in, gets away, maybe there's someone who dropped him off. So there's, maybe we go back and we see somebody who is driving by. So as you mentioned, the cameras, that's a necessity to bring justice later or resolve the issue.
Yeah. Now, you also raised something that often gets overlooked when we spoke earlier, um, and that's how churches investigate serious allegations of leadership failures. Why do those internal investigations fail? What makes them fail?
Yeah, twofold. One is exactly what we've been talking about, which is we're not preparing for it. So now we've got word, and it could be a pastor, it could be an elder, and it could just be a significant member of the church has fallen to some type of moral failure,
Mm.
which, could be as bad as you are imagining, or it could be just other accusations of violence or theft. And it's something that must be addressed. And in the moment, and especially, and we've seen this with pastors, we saw this with Bill Hybels, we saw this with Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill,
Mm.
where the pastor is revered. I believe him. In a he said, she said, well, I know him. He would never do this. And
Right.
also, I don't want to ruin his life and career. And so there's all those hesitancies to take this seriously. And there's the investigation is done internally. So the elder board will look into it. Well, the elder board spends, every, one Wednesday a month and every Sunday with the pastor, and maybe they know this woman or child in passing. And so there's a bias. And that's
Right.
why ahead of time, a church needs to decide this is the outside entity that we have noted will come in and have an unbiased audit into allegations that are going on. And that should be the type of thing now that if a board member or pastor is not guilty, they can feel more justified as opposed to people continuing to talk like, hey, his friends just swept this under the rug.
Yeah. Yeah. So somebody more impartial that doesn't have uh, a bet on either side of either player.
There's going to be bias because this is depending on the type of church you go to. This could either be a wonderful man that you admire to this is God's spokesperson who
Right.
who is next to God and we can't touch him. And that is a danger to everyone in the church. And we see in instances like Hybels and Driscoll, they rise to a position of authority enough where they cannot be questioned. And if you think that a man or a woman can't abuse their position once they get a taste of authority, that's going to cause issues for you.
Right. Right.
For,
So
go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Well, furthermore, one trap that the church falls into is making this a spiritual matter.
Mhm.
So allegations of some type of sexual impropriety, and they go, well, we've talked with both parties. He's going to seek counseling, and we're going to keep this internal. He's acknowledged his sin, and he's going to work on repairing that relationship. And it might be something that needs law enforcement involvement. And
Right.
now you have influence where a victim doesn't feel like they can speak up further. But again, in a cool moment, those decisions need to be made that this is how we will handle it. We will not allow ourselves to be swayed and take care of this internally.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. If a church leader listening today wanted to take just one step toward being better prepared, what would you recommend that they start with?
I would say what we've just been talking about is most important, because if you think about what's most likely, a mass shooting or a moral failure of the pastor, the board, or someone significant in the church, it's 100% the second one that
Right.
happens. And there needs to be a preparation for that. And then otherwise, it's having going through detailed plans and having someone to sit down and think through. I want to look at our church. It's almost the gray hackers, the gray hats who come in and try
Mhm.
to penetrate your IT system. I want someone to come to my church from the outside and come on a Sunday and say, this is what I could do. And now let's talk about how we're going to plug those holes.
All right. Well, Eric, I really appreciate you coming out and doing this interview and talking about this. I think there's a lot more valuable information that we can talk about maybe in further interviews. If you're interested, I'd be happy to have you back on at any time.
Well, I'm retired, so I've got the time.
That's great. Thank you very much for being here. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thanks so much.